A pregnant widow buys a dying soldier for a single dollar. But what he whispers changes everything she thought she knew about loss, love, and family. The sun was barely rising over the horizon as the young widow trudged along the dusty path leading to the village market, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly, every step heavy with exhaustion and worry, her mind filled with memories of the life she once had and the husband she had lost in the war. The air was thick with the scent of bread and herbs and the faint metallic tang of blood from the nearby soldiers who had returned from the front lines. Her eyes scanned the crowded stalls filled with merchants calling out their wares, the bright colors of fabric and the clatter of pots. And pans seemed distant and meaningless against the ache in her chest and the gnawing fear of what the future held for her and her unborn child. She had no family left, no savings and nowhere to turn. Every coin she held felt like a burden, yet she pushed forward, her body aching, her spirit fraying with every step she thought about the child growing inside her and how she had to survive. How she had to find a way to provide a life worth living, despite the darkness that surrounded her. The market was chaotic and overwhelming. Voices rose in a cacophony of noise, merchants haggling with customers and soldiers boasting about their victories and their wounds. She moved carefully through the throng, trying to avoid drawing attention to herself, trying to make herself invisible. Yet her eyes caught sight of a small group gathered around a cart, and curiosity and something deeper drew her closer. There on the cart lay a wounded soldier, his uniform torn and soaked in blood, his breathing shallow and labored, his face obscured by grime and sweat. The crowd murmured about the tragedy of war, about how many lives were lost and how many men returned broken. And she felt an unexpected surge of pity and something she could not name. She knew she could not leave him there. She could not walk away. Even though she had almost nothing to offer, she felt compelled to act. And as the merchant called out a price, she barely believed she heard him whisper a number, $1, without hesitation. She reached into her meager purse and pulled out the single coin, her fingers trembling as she handed it over. Her heart raced and her mind spun with the absurdity of the situation, a pregnant widow buying a stranger for $1, yet she did not question. It did not pause. She only felt a sense of determination and resolve that this act, no matter how small, might change the course of her life and the life of the child she carried. She knelt beside the soldier and gently lifted him from the cart, his weight surprisingly light, despite the injuries he bore, and she cradled him as if she were holding both her past and her future in her arms. She could not know what awaited her in the days to come, but in that moment she felt a strange mixture of fear, hope, and an unspoken promise that she would do everything she could to keep him alive and to survive herself. And she began the long walk home with the wounded soldier pressed to her chest, each step a testament to her courage, her desperation, and her unyielding will to endure against all odds. The small hut she returned to felt emptier than ever. The walls bare and the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and herbs. She laid the soldier gently on the worn mat, her hands trembling, as she tore strips of cloth to dress his wounds. The blood was sticky and dark, and the sight made her stomach twist. Yet she forced herself to keep going, her fingers working with a careful determination she had never known she fetched water from the well and washed his face, noticing the faint lines around his eyes and the way his chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. She whispered words of comfort, though she knew he could not yet respond. The days that followed were long and grueling. She cooked small meals and coaxed him to drink, and even when he groaned in pain or his eyes fluttered open in confusion, she remained steadfast, her own fatigue pressing against her. But she ignored it for the sake of the fragile life she held in, her arms and the one growing inside her. She began to notice the way he looked at her when he was semi-conscious, as if searching for something familiar, and sometimes a flicker of recognition passed over his face, like a shadow she tried to push. The thought aside, telling herself it was just weakness or delirium, Yet deep inside, she felt a stir of something more, a strange pull that made her heart tighten and her pulse quicken. Each evening she would sit by his side singing softly to calm him, and sometimes he would murmur sounds she could almost understand, fragments of words and names that made her chest ache with longing and curiosity. She watched him sleep with a mixture of fear and tenderness, wondering what he remembered and what he had forgotten. She made a small bed near the fire for herself, so she could be near him every moment. The silence between them was heavy, yet it was filled with an unspoken connection that grew. With each passing day, she began to talk to him about the outside world, telling him about the village, the market, the changing seasons, and the tiny life growing inside her. Even though she knew he could not respond, it was as if speaking these things anchored both of them to the present and gave her a sense of control over the chaos of their circumstances as the soldier's strength slowly returned. She realized the task she had undertaken was greater than she had imagined. Every groan, every flicker of pain demanded her attention and drained her spirit. Yet she could not leave him, nor could she abandon the hope that he carried with him something she could not name. A quiet bond was forming, a fragile thread of trust that tethered their lives together, and even in the midst of exhaustion and fear, she found herself anticipating the moments he would open his eyes and look at her, as if trying to place her in the landscape of his memory. And though uncertainty loomed over their future, she began to feel a strange comfort in their shared silence and in the slow rhythm of care that became their new existence. As the days turned into weeks, the soldier's body began to regain strength, though his mind remained clouded with confusion and fragmented memories. He would wake at odd hours, staring into the distance, his eyes haunted by images he could not name. Yet there was a growing recognition in the way he looked at the widow, as if somewhere deep inside he sensed familiarity and safety. She continued to care for him with unwavering attention, tending to his wounds, feeding him gentle broths, and speaking softly to anchor him in the present. Yet she also began to notice small slips, a name on the tip of his tongue, a gesture he made that mirrored someone she once knew. Her heart would leap with hope and then sink with fear, for she dared not imagine what it could mean. The tension between them grew like a delicate thread stretched tight with every shared glance and every word that almost made sense. Sometimes he would whisper fragments of stories from the battlefield, names of villages' faces, of soldiers lost, and in those moments she felt an ache that was both sorrow and anticipation. She questioned her own sanity, as memories she thought were buried began to resurface in her mind, and she found herself watching him, constantly noting the smallest details, the tilt of his head, the cadence of his voice, the way he flinched at certain sounds. It was as if the universe had planted pieces of a puzzle in front of her, and she had to decipher them before it was too late one evening. As the fire flickered low and shadows danced across the walls, he reached out and grasped her hand, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart race. He spoke in a hoarse whisper, a question she could barely comprehend, and yet it resonated with something buried deep inside her. She felt the hairs on her arms rise and a chill pass through her body. The realization that he might not be just any soldier, that the pieces of the past and present were converging in ways she had not dared imagine, left her breathless and trembling. She could feel the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them both, and the air seemed to thrum with anticipation, as if holding its breath, waiting for the revelation that would change everything. And though fear gripped her, she also felt a spark of hope that in uncovering his identity, she might find a bridge to her lost husband and a chance to make sense of the chaos that had consumed her life since his death. Each day brought new fragments of memory, new signs that something extraordinary lay beneath the surface of his confusion, and she clung to the belief that if she was patient and steadfast, the soldier would reveal the truth hidden behind the veil of war and injury. and that in that revelation she might find not only answers, but a path forward for herself and the child she carried in her womb. The evening air was heavy with tension as the soldier lay resting on the cot, his eyes slowly opening to meet hers. The dim light flickered across his face, and for a moment he seemed distant, as if reaching through time and memory, before he spoke, his voice barely audible, yet laced with urgency and something raw. He whispered words that made her blood run cold. And her heart seize, he told her that he was not a stranger, that he carried the blood and bond of her late husband, that he was his brother, and that the war had torn them apart, leaving him missing and presumed dead. She could hardly breathe, her hands shaking as the truth sank in. The room seemed to shrink around her. The sound of the fire crackling, the distant chirp of crickets, and the rustle of leaves outside all faded into a hollow silence. The revelation brought a storm of emotions: grief for her lost husband, sorrow for the years that had been stolen, and yet a flicker of relief and recognition that somehow fate had woven a connection back into her life. The soldier's eyes searched hers for understanding, and she could see in them the same mixture of fear and hope that mirrored her own. She struggled to find words to respond, her mind reeling with questions and disbelief. Yet she felt the undeniable pull of kinship and the unspoken bond of family growing between them. In the days that followed, the shock of the revelation settled into a tentative reality. They spoke of the past, of the brother she had never met fully, of the pain and horrors of war, and the moments that had shaped them both. Each conversation was heavy with emotion, yet carried a strange comfort in finally knowing the truth. They laughed softly at shared memories that were distant, yet familiar, and cried together over the ones that would never return. The presence of her husband's brother brought a new dimension to her life, a mixture of solace and complication. The grief for her husband remained raw, yet now it was tempered by connection and the possibility of a future built on understanding and support as they navigated this new reality. She felt the weight of responsibility not only for herself and her unborn child, but for this man who had returned to her life in such an unexpected way. The bond between them deepened with each passing day, a mixture of gratitude, love for family, and the quiet determination to survive and heal together. The world outside remained harsh and uncertain, but within the walls of her small home, a fragile peace began to form, woven from care, courage, and the tentative threads of a family. Reunited against the odds, the days that followed carried a rhythm of quiet healing and tentative hope. The widow and her husband's brother settled into a routine that blended care with conversation and shared memories. Each day brought new challenges: the lingering pain of war, the demands of her pregnancy, and the uncertainty of what the future might hold. Yet amidst it all, a fragile bond grew between them, rooted in trust and the unspoken understanding of loss and survival. They spoke of the husband. She had lost the brother. He had mourned, and together they pieced together fragments of the past, creating a tapestry of stories, laughter, and tears that offered both comfort and clarity. She watched him regain strength and move with more confidence, his presence, a steadying force in her world, and she felt a sense of relief that she was no longer entirely alone. The anticipation of her child's arrival added another layer of hope and purpose. She imagined holding the baby in her arms and sharing with them the story of courage, resilience, and family that had carried them through the darkest days as her belly grew. He would sit by her side, offering gentle words, guidance, and protection. And in those moments she realized that, while life had dealt them unimaginable pain, it had also offered a second chance, a new beginning forged from tragedy and love together. They prepared for the future, securing what little resources they had, and dreaming of a life where the child would know both parents' legacy and the strength of family. Even in the harshest circumstances, their bond deepened, not through romance, but through shared experience. empathy, and the quiet understanding that sometimes survival itself was an act of love. The day finally came when the widow gave birth, the house filled with the cries of new life and the warmth of a family reborn. The soldier, now fully her husband's brother, held the tiny child with reverence and awe, a connection formed. Instantly across generations and loss, they looked at each other and silently acknowledged that though the path had been twisted and cruel, they had found each other again, and in that reunion found hope and strength to face whatever the world might bring. Together, they began a new chapter, their lives intertwined by blood memory and the unwavering will to endure. And the small home, once filled with sorrow, now brimmed with the quiet joy of survival, love, and the promise of tomorrow.